distinguished members of the Forum, distinguished delegates, observers, and friends. With great pleasure and honor, I now declare open the 15th session of the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues. It is a special pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations. In accordance with the customs of the indigenous peoples and in recognition of the peoples of these lands, we will now have a traditional ceremonial welcome by the Chief of the Onondaga Nation, Chief Tababaho Sit Hill.
Suodahon si jostakin johka. Nai ja sungwawi ne sungwai disa isa ni ungwai hotai. Nai ne hadik don ni ungwai teke skadah ne en ni ondeka. Na ko en dwadia ta ne gana henyo. I dit ne gen gai honda kwa tanon en katogohto ne o hende gai hodekui. En da na ko ja toni wando de toni wan tate se de ne skano ai tuano dunyo hek. En da na ko ja ni di ungwai teke ungwai yosi ne tona ne skada huet wain kwa ni go ha I den dwadia ta den dwadat no ha dane to di ne tek ton kwa ni go ha en ai di to do sonyo za ason sung kwa na wain kwa en da na di with what de no nya skada hen dwa kwa ni go ha o set wat na ha ne gain hya ge hanage ne sung kwa di sai dane to di ne tek ton kwa ni go ha dane ta
I thank Chief Tadataho Sit Hill for the ceremonial welcome to the 15th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Distinguished members of the Forum, distinguished delegates, we shall now proceed to the first item on the agenda, the election of the chair for this session. I first gave the floor to Ms. Maria Eugenia Chuka Quisp. Now the floor is yours.
Al inicio de esta sesión, quiero agradecer a nuestras deidades que nos están permitiendo encontrarnos nuevamente y que nos acompañan en este gran evento de importancia para nuestros pueblos. En mi condición de miembro experta del Foro Permanente, quiero también saludar a mis hermanos y hermanas, amigos y amigas, a las organizaciones de los pueblos indígenas, a las agencias de las Naciones Unidas, a los miembros de los estados, a todos y todas quienes llegaron a este evento, a los trabajos de coordinación de los pueblos indígenas, de las organizaciones, asimismo, a tratarse temas tan importantes como es el tema de mujeres indígenas, y también quiero saludar con gran afecto y cariño a la juventud que nos acompaña en este evento. Hayaya, muchas gracias.
I thank Ms. Crisp for the nomination of Mr. Alvaro Pop as chair of the 15th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. May I now take it that it is the wish of members of the Permanent Forum to elect Mr. Alvaro Pop as the chair of the 15th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues by acclamation. It is so decided. I wish to extend my warmest congratulations to Mr. Alvaro Pop on his election. I'm confident that he will guide this session of the forum to a successful conclusion. I would like to invite Mr. Pop to take over the proceedings of the meeting. Before doing so, I would like to thank Ms. Megan Davis for her leading role as the chair of the 14th session of the forum and invite her to pass the baton to Mr. Alvaro Pop as the newly elected chair of the forum.
Eshana eshinchukwa Mantioshe ere shine kamchakarin Antioshe ere nakwanko manukilkak ángel Mantioshana Mantioshakwa. Distinguidos miembros del foro, distinguidos delegados, observadores y amigos. Quisiera dar las gracias al señor Gu Hongbu, secretario general adjunto del Departamento de Asuntos Económicos y Sociales, por haber inaugurado el periodo de sesiones y celebro su presencia aquí esta mañana. También quisiera agradecer a los miembros del Foro Permanente por haberme elegido presidente del 15º periodo de sesiones. Haré todo lo posible por estar a la altura de sus expectativas y velaré porque el periodo de sesiones se celebre sin tropiezos. Como presidente de este periodo de sesiones, me complace en particular, en nombre de los miembros del foro, dar una cálida bienvenida a nuestros distinguidos invitados a esta sesión de apertura. El excelentísimo Morgens Lukentoff, presidente de la Asamblea General, el excelentísimo señor Sven Jürgenson, vicepresidente del Consejo Económico y Social, a la señora excelentísima Aura Leticia Teleguario, ministra de Trabajo y Previsión Social de Guatemala, y a la excelentísima señora Jody Wilson-Rayburn, ministra de Justicia del Canadá. Distinguidos miembros del foro, distinguidos observadores, amigos, señoras y señores. En primer lugar, veremos a continuación un mensaje en video enviado por el excelentísimo señor Ban Ki-moon, secretario general de Naciones Unidas. Por favor.
Excellencies, distinguished members of the Permanent Forum, distinguished elders and representatives of indigenous peoples' organizations, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to send greetings to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I welcome your focus on conflict, peace, and resolution. Indigenous peoples are increasingly being drawn into conflicts over their lands, resources, and rights. Lasting peace requires that indigenous peoples have access to cultural, social, and economic justice. The 2014 World Conference on Indigenous Peoples called on the United Nations to ensure a coherent approach. In response, we have developed a system-wide action plan which we will launch today. It is essential that we work as one to realize the full rights of indigenous peoples. I commend the President of the General Assembly for beginning consultations on the further participation of indigenous peoples at the United Nations. Member states are beginning implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. We must ensure that indigenous peoples, including women, participate and benefit. I wish you a successful session and look forward to its outcome. Thank you.
Invito ahora al excelentísimo señor Morgens Ligentoff, presidente de la Asamblea General, a formular una declaración. Por favor.
Distinguished representatives of indigenous peoples, ministers, Ambassador Jorgensen, Under-Secretary General Wu, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor to address this 15th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and to welcome all of you here in the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations. I do it with pleasure, also at the background of having, in my time as Danish parliamentarian and minister, very close and warm relations with the people of Greenland in particular. Nearly 2 years ago, in September 2014, the General Assembly held the first World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, where member states reaffirmed their commitment to support, respect, promote, and advance the rights of indigenous peoples, and to uphold the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Furthermore, the theme that you will address during this 15th session of the Forum, Indigenous Peoples, Conflict, Peace and Resolution, is of course a very critical one. It comes during a year when member states are reflecting on how best to strengthen the UN's role and the UN's effectiveness in the area of peace and security. I am very pleased that the Permanent Forum members took the initiative to tackle such a difficult and important theme, and I look forward to hear the outcome from your deliberations. I wish you a very successful and productive session. Thank you very much for meeting us here in the UN General Assembly Hall.
Doy las gracias al presidente de la Asamblea General por su declaración. Invito ahora al excelentísimo señor Sven Jurgenson, vicepresidente del Consejo Económico y Social, a formular una declaración.
Distinguished members of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, distinguished representatives of member states, indigenous peoples organizations and non-governmental organizations, distinguished representatives of the UN system and other intergovernmental organizations, distinguished elders, distinguished youth, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to address the opening of the 15th session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This is the first time that the Permanent Forum meets after the adoption of the historical 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. Indigenous peoples organizations, including the Permanent Forum, took an active role in the consultation and negotiation process towards the 2030 Agenda. The results of this strong engagement are clear in the final framework, which, apart from the 6 direct references to indigenous peoples, to a high degree includes indigenous peoples' priorities such as equality, non-discrimination, human rights, and of course, protection of our Mother Earth. In that way, the Sustainable Development Goals are a step forward for indigenous peoples compared to the Millennium Development Goals. Especially important for the indigenous peoples is the 2030 Agenda's grounding in human rights principles and standards, Article 10, and that implementation of the agenda will take human rights into account, including, of course, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples have the same right to enjoy peace, security, and human rights as anyone else, although in reality they have not always enjoyed these rights. We look forward to your recommendations and to be guided by the Permanent Forum's continued engagement and contribution to the UN family. Thank you.
Doy las gracias al vicepresidente del Consejo Económico y Social por su declaración. Distinguidos miembros del foro, procederemos ahora a elegir a los demás miembros de la mesa para este periodo de sesiones. Para ello, doy la palabra en primer lugar a la señora Joanne Carlin.
Mr. Chair, let me first congratulate you for your election as the chair of the forum on its 15th session. On behalf of the members of the forum, I have the pleasure to nominate Mr. Oliver Lude as the rapporteur, and Mr. Devashis Roy, Ms. Mariam Abobakrin, Ms. Isa Mokabenova, and Dr. Daly Sambodoro as the members of the Bureau. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Doy las gracias a la señora Carlin por postular. Doy ahora la palabra a la señora Balmani Toki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate you on your appointment as Chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues. I support the nomination as proposed by Ms. Carling. Thank you.
Doy las gracias a la señora Toki por su declaración. Puedo considerar que los miembros del foro desean elegir por aclamación a la señora Marian Baled Mohamed Abukarraine, la señora Aisa Bukabenova, la señora Dalí Sambo Doru y el señor Rajat Devashis Roy como vicepresidentes, y al señor Oliver Londe como relator del 15º periodo de sesiones del Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas. Así queda acordado. Distinguidos miembros del foro, distinguidos observadores, amigos, señoras y señores, tengo ahora el alto honor de invitar al señor Hu Hombo, secretario general adjunto del Departamento de Asuntos Económicos y Sociales, a formular una declaración. Por favor.
Your Excellency, Mr. Alvaro Pop, the Chair of the 15th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Excellencies, distinguished members of a Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, distinguished delegates, honorable elders, distinguished representatives of indigenous peoples' organizations, distinguished representatives of the United Nations system, other intergovernmental organizations, and of civil society. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to address the opening of the 15th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you, representatives from indigenous peoples, member states, the UN system, and from non-governmental organizations who have gathered here to work together to advance the rights and well-being of indigenous peoples. Welcome. As you know, at the 2014 World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, member states adopted a strong commitment to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The World Conference also included some important mandates for the UN system, including myself. We take these mandates very seriously, and we have been working hard to fulfill them. One clear mandate for the UN was to develop a system-wide action plan for ensuring a coherent approach to achieving the ends of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now the focus is on implementation. Now is the time for the United Nations system to work hand in hand with indigenous peoples and the member states for the common good of us all. Indigenous peoples continue to suffer disproportionately from poverty, discrimination, poor health care, and inadequate education. These challenges are very real and they are serious. But with concerted efforts, we can make a difference. I look forward to the deliberations during the session and especially to your proposals and recommendations on how we best can move forward. I wish you all a successful and fruitful session of the Permanent Forum. Thank you.
Doy las gracias al secretario general adjunto del Departamento de Asuntos Económicos y Sociales por su declaración y aprecio la presentación del sistema de acción. Esta tarde, a las 15 horas, empezaremos el debate sobre el tema 3 del programa, seguimiento de las recomendaciones del Foro Permanente. La reunión tendrá lugar en la sala de conferencias 4. Se recuerda a las delegaciones que está abierta la inscripción en línea para la lista de oradores sobre los pueblos indígenas. Los expertos del foro reiteramos nuestro compromiso con el planteamiento de nuestros pueblos y su llamado a una nueva ética en la producción de la riqueza. El foro está listo, como siempre, a seguir escuchando y promoviendo los cambios necesarios. Se levanta la sesión. Gracias. Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning.
Abierta la
I call to order the third meeting of the 15th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Distinguidos miembros del foro,
Distinguished members of the Forum, distinguished observers, friends, ladies and gentlemen, this morning we shall consider Agenda Item 4, implementation of the 6 mandated areas of the Permanent Forum with reference to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The 6 mandated areas are namely health, education, human rights, economic and social development, environment and culture. We now begin listening to the speakers inscribed on the list under Item 4. Before we begin our substantive debate, I'd like to remind you of the time limit for statements in order to accommodate all those participants who wish to make statements. I intend to strictly implement the time limit of 5 minutes. If a speaker should exceed the time limit, I will have to intervene in order to ensure sound time management. I would kindly request all speakers to observe the time limit. We'll begin by hearing a statement from our colleague from the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Ed John.
Buenos dias. Good morning. I'd like to thank you to our chair for indulging briefly this morning. I wanted to advise the delegation chair, representatives, and our members of the Permanent Forum that there is a very massive forest fire in the northern part of Canada, in Alberta, and that some 80,000 people have been evacuated as a result. Countless families have lost their homes, and many Indigenous families and communities are being impacted as well. So I want to say, as we begin our work here today, to remember the very difficult times that all of those families are going through, and to keep them in our hearts as we do our work today. So, muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, John. And our solidarity with the families of the communities in Alberta, Canada, that are going through very difficult times. We hope that won't be a human tragedy and that the families are able to recover what they've lost. So we reiterate our solidarity from the chair and as the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Let's now begin with our work. Give the floor to Mr. Per Olsen, Secretary of State of the Minister of Culture of Sweden.
Thank you, Chair. I have the honor to make this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark with Greenland, Iceland, Norway, Finland, and my own country, Sweden. We do not even exist. We are subterranean beings. We are invisible. You can walk through us, and they will laugh if you tell them that we have homes, camps, that we also have rights, that we do exist. We do not seem to exist, and those who do not exist cannot demand anything. Chair, human rights defenders engaged in the promotion of human rights of indigenous peoples are targeted and subject to intimidation, harassment, and violence. Civic space is shrinking in many countries. Legal restrictions have been imposed in more than 50 countries during later years. In some countries, indigenous human rights defenders are particularly subjected to violence, too often resulting in tragic deaths. Attacks on human rights defenders worldwide must come to an end. A clear message was sent in March when the UN Human Rights Council adopted the Norwegian-led resolution on the protection of human rights defenders, which explicitly mentions the situation of indigenous human rights defenders. The Nordic countries call strongly on all states to abide by their human rights obligations and commitments by ensuring that indigenous human rights defenders can work without fear of being subjected to any form of reprisal, harassment, intimidation, or violence. Mr. Chair, as concluded by the Special Rapporteur in her report to the Human Rights Council in September, the situation faced by indigenous women and girls is particularly severe. Indigenous women and girls experience complex, multidimensional and mutually reinforcing human rights violations and abuses. Indigenous women and girls also suffer from different forms of violence, including sexual and gender-based violence. The Nordic countries would therefore like to place specific emphasis on the importance of safeguarding the rights of indigenous women and girls. We consider it vital that these human rights violations and abuses, including the causes and consequences of violence against indigenous women and girls, are thoroughly addressed and that those responsible are held accountable. Now, finally, Mr. Chair, let me conclude by saying that the protection of human rights of indigenous peoples is a matter of justice and decency. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Indigenous peoples are not exempted. It is the responsibility of all states to ensure that the human rights of indigenous peoples are protected. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to the representative of Métis National Council, Clement Chartier.
Good morning, forum members, delegations here present. My name is Clement Chartier, also known as Clem Chartier. I am the president of the Métis Nation. As indigenous peoples globally, we have come a long way in our quest for securing our rightful place within the world community and within our respective homelands. As a young man, I attended my first international meeting in 1976, 40 years ago, the first United Nations Habitat Conference held in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. There, I once again had an opportunity to listen to George Manuel speak about the global indigenous struggle for justice and rights, as he then was the president of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, which was formed the previous year, 1975. We believe that Canada's re-engagement will also be of assistance to us there, and we expect that Canada will be joining us next week and making positive statements. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor now to the WIPO. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for giving us the floor. My name is Haientwa Lima from Samoa. I'm the WIPO Indigenous Fellow and have the honour to speak on behalf of the WIPO Secretariat. We would like to start by extending our warm thanks to the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum for the organisation of the present session and wishing the distinguished members of the Forum and yourself a fruitful session. The present Agenda Item 4 refers to the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples and its implementation throughout the 6 mandated areas of the Forum. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, the representative of WIPO. I give the floor to Madam Sarah Deccan of the Cordillera People's Alliance.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity to speak. Warm greetings, everyone. I represent the Cordillera People's Alliance, Philippines, which has consistently participated in the Permanent Forum since its first session in 2002, recognizing the important role of the Forum in advancing indigenous people's rights. The Forum has allowed us to raise the issues and concerns of the Igorots and other indigenous peoples of the Philippines. We have forwarded numerous recommendations to the Permanent Forum in line with our struggle to defend our rights to land and resources that are being robbed by the state and foreign corporations. However, we are deeply alarmed that after 14 sessions of the Permanent Forum and 9 years since the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the plight of indigenous peoples in the Philippines has turned from bad to worse. The Philippine government enacted the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act and established the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, supposedly to promote the rights and welfare of Philippine indigenous peoples. But these have been proven inutile in protecting our rights. In fact, the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples has served as an instrument in violating indigenous peoples' rights. And the UN DRIP and previous recommendations of the Permanent Forum have not been implemented at all. Instead, the Philippine government continues its reign of terror, committing crimes against indigenous peoples and outrightly violating our collective rights to our ancestral lands and plunder of our resources through destructive mining and energy projects. We thus urge the Permanent Forum to take immediate and decisive steps to end the extrajudicial killings and indigenous peoples' rights violations and the state-driven misery faced by indigenous peoples in the Philippines. That the Philippine government be urged to comply with its obligations under international humanitarian law, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and other international human rights instruments to which the Philippine government is a signatory. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Give the floor now to Mr. Boyan Radoikov of the UN Organization for Education, Science and Culture, UNESCO.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Mr. Chairperson, distinguished participants in this forum, it is an honor for me to be able to address this noble audience today in New York on the occasion of the 15th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. As you know, UNESCO has a unique mandate in the fields of education, natural, social and human sciences, culture, communication and information. Its policies, programs and projects provide opportunities and have significant impact on the development of indigenous people worldwide. Our work is at 3 levels: policy level, operational level, and normative level. I am pleased to inform you that UNESCO developed a house-wide policy on engaging with indigenous people, launched at the 36th session of the General Conference in November 2011. This process moved forward by steadily with meetings and consultative workshops and events organized with indigenous people and their organizations in Santiago, in Chile, Luanda, Angola, Chiang Mai, Thailand, and New York, Geneva, and Paris. This policy will be finalized and submitted for consideration and possible adoption at the spring session in 2017 of UNESCO's Executive Board. Before ending, allow me to stress the tangible impact and the recognized significance of our work in this area. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, it is about effectively protecting the invaluable tangible and intangible heritage of our world, which is rich. Our world is rich with its multidimensional diversity, with its irreplaceable variety of mixtures of small and large communities and nations, with its constantly innovating know-how, technologies and policies to accumulate and preserve knowledge for the future generations about the past and present traditions, cultures and civilizations. Thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the representative of UNESCO. Give the floor to Adi Asenaka Kaukau
De las Islas Fiji.
of the Fiji Islands Indigenous Peoples Foundation.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair and members of the forum. It is my privilege this morning to introduce my colleague. I'm here, my colleague Ratu Israeli Vananalangi Vesikula. He is going to talk on behalf of the Fiji Indigenous Peoples Foundation for the Indigenous Peoples of Fiji.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, participants, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I would like to continue from where our speaker and Timblinda and Yasanada Daudau left off yesterday, and to highlight to this forum the failure of the Fiji government to comply and recognize the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People since the Ambani Marama government military coup in 2006. I want to also mention at this point that we are talking about a government that continues to instill fear and crime to the indigenous people of Fiji. On top of that, Mr. Chair, let me say that the government also, as a show of insult to our brothers from West Papua, has entered into a bilateral agreement with the Indonesian government to come into Fiji and to do some work on one of our respectable schools, indigenous schools, Queen Victoria School, named after the Queen of England, and also a sign of disrespect to the indigenous people of Fiji. Let me continue, Mr. Chairman. The government's refusal to recognize the convention was evident on record in one of the parliamentary debates over land to be returned to IPs, or indigenous people, where the Honorable Attorney General and Minister for Justice, Mr. Ayas Kayum, said that the convention, Mr. Chairman, is basically a mere declaration and is not a law under international law and not binding on Fiji. Mr. Chairman, this is a sign of disrespect, and I bring it before the forum to please consider and note.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll give the floor now to Kerry Nuku, New Zealand Nurses Organisation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to present for the first time to the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues. I'd like to introduce myself, Kerry Nuku, my colleagues Pari Tautari and Tracy Morgan. Our organisation represents the largest membership of Māori nurses, midwives, students and health professionals in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The New Zealand Human Rights Commission documents A Fair Go for All indicated that in health, another form of structural discrimination is the underrepresentation of a Māori health workforce. Without measuring the problem in a manner consistent with epidemiological base of modern health, no confidence can be placed in a Māori health workforce strategy or achieving health equity for Māori. We believe that such data is essential for the development of evidence-based strategies to address the Māori health workforce deficits, which contribute to endemic and increasing systemic health disparities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Give the floor to Ronald Waromi, West Papua Interest Association.
Yes, thank you. Wah. Distinguished Chairperson of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and members, Indigenous brothers and sisters, United Nations member states, Indigenous Parliament members, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you
for giving us West Papua indigenous people the opportunity for presenting the aspiration of our people in the 15th session of UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It is over 53 years since 1963, Netherlands, New Guinea, or West Papua joined with Indonesia as Irian Jaya, and the dishonest result of the Act of Free Choice in 1969, which our human rights and fundamental freedom in West Papua have never been fully guaranteed. This political process is still being questioned by West Papua indigenous people and have called for the independence. We West Papua indigenous people continue to suffer discrimination, marginalization, extreme poverty, continue to face the ongoing conflict, human rights abuses, the ongoing genocide, our race and way of life under the threat of extinction. The implementation of the Special Autonomy Law number 21 of the year 2001 in Papua province amidst various humanitarian problems and not shown any significant change. However, indigenous people of West Papua rejected the special autonomy and continue call for self-determination and independence. To be known by the international community, on 7th of March 2016, this year, the Solidarity of Papuan Public Servants gathered in Jayapura and signed on the banner in supporting Governor and Deputy Governor of Papua Province statement to return the Special Autonomy Law number 21 of the year 2001 back to Indonesia's central government. The human rights violation which continue to occur among indigenous West Papuan, which was highlighted in the report of Human Rights Council Working Group on Universal Periodic Review. The conflict and human rights violation in West Papua continue to increase in several places, such as in Jayapura, Timika, Wamena, Puncak, Lanijaya, Tinggi Nambut, Puncak Jaya, Paniai, Oksibil, Manokwari, Sorong, and Serui. And to be known by the international community, indigenous people of West Papua face the ongoing conflict and human rights violation because of our demand for self-determination and independence. However, the human rights violation in West Papua has been forgotten by the international community. United Nations do not see West Papua human rights situation with one eye, but we need both eyes. Therefore, through this 15th session of the unpfii, we representative and indigenous people of West Papua are here today in the United Nations in New York. We call upon the United Nations Secretary General. We need a peaceful solution for the ongoing conflict and human rights violation in West Papua. We ask the United Nations system to follow up the recommendation of UN Permanent Forum and to follow up the report of the study on decolonization in the Pacific region by Ms. Falmentoki. We West Papua indigenous people call upon the United Nations for exercising our right to self-determination and to determine our political status according to the provision contained in the Charter of the United Nations, Article 1 of the ICCPR, ISEC, and the Article 3 of UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People, which state that all people, and indigenous people, have the right to self-determination. Wah, 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 wah. I thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias, hermano.
Thank you very much, brothers. Give the floor now to Madam Caroline Bennett, Minister for Indigenous Issues in the Northern Territories of Canada.
Mr. Chairperson, members of the Permanent Forum, before I begin, I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Lenape people. I would also like to acknowledge elders Willie Littlechild, Sally Webster, and Oliver Boulette, who are part of our delegation and who are here with us representing as elders Canada's 3 distinct Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit people, and the Métis Nation. It is time for a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. All of these mandate letters were made public, and by doing so, the Prime Minister spoke to all Canadians. Today, we are addressing Canada's position on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm here to announce, on behalf of Canada, that we are now a full supporter of the Declaration without qualification.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Madam Minister. We appreciate your words. Madam Minister, thank you very much. Very valuable words. The Permanent Forum welcomes the presentation of this position and the willingness to improve better relations with Indigenous people. Thank you very much.
Si usted quiere hacer unas palabras.
If you wish to make some closing comments, please do.
In closing, thank you, Mr. Chair. When speaking of the legacy of residential schools, Hereditary Chief Ray Jones told us of a Gitsin phrase, "Shed dim ama gau dingu mal," meaning the canoe must be uprighted. With our commitment to full adoption and implementation to the Declaration today, we are continuing the vital work of reconciliation and working to upright that canoe. Thank you, merci beaucoup, masicho, kuyanomik, migwich, masti.
Felicitamos la nueva.
We welcome the new position of Canada and we're grateful for its presentation today. I give the floor to Mr. Royal Rigoko, the Deputy Minister for Marginalised Communities of Namibia.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair, to give me this important or noble opportunity to say something in this very important forum. Your Excellency, Mr. Alvaro Easton Ben Pop, Chairperson of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dear comrades. My name is Royal J.K. Kikokto, Deputy Minister responsible for the marginalized communities, and these communities are the San or the Kalahari Bushmen, as we are well known, the Ovatwe and Ovachimba communities. On the implementation of the 6 mandate areas of the Permanent Forum, with the reference to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the mandate areas are being of health, education, human rights, economic and social development, environment and culture. Namibia would like to comment as follows. We are to I'm using my native language to show that in Africa, particularly in the Republic of Namibia, we have got indigenous who are also holding a very high profile in the cabinet. Namibia voted way back for this declaration in 2007 with other 147 member states of the United Nations, and has since attended almost all the sessions of the forum and participated effectively. Ocha Namibia ko bara uge eko shega eko 2 days and ko 7 as some kwangore kale sako some cha ngore osi ngore wasi go gati ngaga duga te acha ikadu kameka go kale Namibia a hoa educhis wasa nga du.
Muchísimas gracias, señor viceministro.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. I give the floor now to Mr. Robert Mirsel, Vivat International Franciscans International.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Franciscans International, Vivat International, and Passionists International welcome the forum's theme, Indigenous Peoples, Conflict, Peace and Resolution. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples affirms that indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands and territories, Article 10, and that indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired, Article 26. We are deeply preoccupied by the situations affecting indigenous peoples in Honduras, Argentina, Brazil, West Papua, Indonesia, the Philippines, whose rights are not respected, protected, or fulfilled, but threatened and violated by economic development choices and strategies. Our observation is that governments of the said countries often signed up contracts with companies to carry out mega projects without guaranteeing due participation of indigenous people and instead criminalizing them for defending their rights. Such was the case of the Lencha, the indigenous people in Honduras, as they defended their rights against the hydroelectric dams project, which was planned to build up along the Gualcarchue River, which is their territories. Or the case of Garabi and Panambi hydroelectric power plants in Argentina, which, according to the movement of affected by dams, will take 80,000 hectares, affecting 15,000 households from 30 states municipalities, both in Misiones and Corrientes provinces, Argentina, and Brazil's Rio Grande do Sul state. Mining explorations and exploitations in countries such as Indonesia, Brazil, and the Philippines have not only been destructive, but also marginalized and excluded indigenous peoples from their territories. In Indonesia, for example, Freeport-McMoran continues to exploit the land and territories of the West Papuans, undermining the fundamental rights of the people. In Mindanao, Philippines, the Lumat indigenous community is affected by government policies on development projects, including mining and land conversion. Meanwhile, land grabbing has occurred massively for the expansion of palm oil plantation in Borneo and West Papua, Indonesia, both by transnational and national corporations through the concession given by national and local governments, excluding local and indigenous peoples' participation in violations of rights of indigenous peoples, including the rights to free, prior, and informed consent. Finally, the violations of human rights of activists, environmentalists, and human rights defenders are also great concern. The Catholic Justice and Peace Commission of Brisbane published a report entitled, "We Will Lose Everything," following a 2-week visit to West Papua in February 2016 by 2 Australian human rights defenders, Peter Arndt and Susan Connolly. The report documents the human rights violations in West Papua. Brutal repression by Indonesian security forces continues unabatedly today, and the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission heard and saw evidence of ongoing systematic violence and intimidation, including arrests, beating, torture, and killings of Papuans taking peaceful action to demonstrate their demand for an end to security forces' violence. In addition to this, LBH Jakarta, a legal aid institution based in Jakarta, released a report on May 3rd, 2016 on the arrest and at least 1,780 West Papuans in different cities and towns in Indonesia, while demonstrating peacefully in commemoration of May 1st, 1963, as West Papua administration was transferred to Indonesia. In Brazil, as showed by the Universal Periodical Review, conducted in 2012, serious concerns include continuing violations committed against human rights defenders, working to promote the rights related to the land tenure and ownership and the rights of indigenous peoples. These are only some of the examples of ongoing violations of indigenous peoples' rights, both by governments and national and transnational corporations, and of how indigenous people's life really matters. Without fair policies and social justice, there will never be peace and true social development. Therefore, we urge member states in which these violations have occurred and in which these indigenous communities live to respect and protect the rights of the indigenous peoples of their countries, including their rights to the lands, territories and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, otherwise used or acquired in compliance with Article 26 of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Protect and respect the rights of human rights defenders working in favor of indigenous peoples' rights, especially their rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Review all laws, policies and licenses regarding mining operations and the expansion of encroachments of indigenous land and territories to the benefit of cash crop plantations such as palm oil, under which indigenous peoples are forcibly evicted from their lands and which violate their rights to lands, territories and resources. Respect and protect the rights of the West Papuan activists who demand freedom, justice and dignity, including their rights to freedom of expression and of peaceful assembly, as well as the right to due process of those who are maintained to detention after their arrest by Indonesian security forces on May 1st and 2nd, 2016 in several cities and towns during a peaceful demonstration. And finally, develop comprehensive investigations on violations of human rights and abuses against indigenous peoples and ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice and effective remedies are guaranteed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'm going to allow for one final presentation before adjourning. And for me, it's a pleasure to give the floor to Madam Kunti Kumari Shahi, Minister of State, Ministry of Local Development and Federal Affairs of Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It gives me immense pleasure to address the United Nations Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues from the national perspective of Nepal today. Mr. Chairman, Nepal is multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural, and multi-religious country. There are over 125 ethnic groups with over 123 living languages and 10 different religions. 59 of those ethnic groups are enlisted as indigenous nationalities. To conclude, Mr. Chairman, we take pride in the diversity we have in Nepal. The unity in our past diversity has always been a source of strength in our nation building. While we continue to respect and further consolidate the unity among all nationalities, we look forward to the international community for an enhanced level of partnership for the effective result in the 6 mandated areas. To that end, I call on all to join hands together in adding value to the lives of indigenous peoples of Nepal. I thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. We've gone beyond 1 o'clock, therefore I'm going to adjourn the meeting. This afternoon at 3 p.m. in the same room, the forum will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 4 on implementation of the 6 mandated areas of the Permanent Forum with reference to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The meeting is adjourned.